Hello, and thank you, everyone. We appreciate you taking time to join us today. Microbial Insight is delighted to have Dr. Kate Clark, the Technical Director at Microbial Insights, and also Dr. Sam Bresolina, Director of Research and Development at Microbial Insights. Kate and Sam will be discussing about selecting the right QuantArray for your project, while Microbial Insight is celebrating the 30 years being in business. Over the past 30 years, Microbial Insights has developed over 150 different CENSUS qPCR assays. Due to the complexity of interactions between the microbial community and their environments, we've seen that in many instances, multiple qPCR assays are needed to understand the processes at work in a system. There were lots of changing during the last 30 years, and MI kept pace with it through numerous innovation and novel approaches. Dr. Kate Clark supervises the daily scientific and technical operations at MI, coordinating with multiple parties, including lab directors, clients, project managers, and technical writers, to ensure that high quality, accurate results are delivered on time and or high customer service standards are upheld. With expertise and experience ranging from lab bench to field sites, is uniquely suited for project development and management, aiding clients from molecular biological tools, assay selection, and study design through reporting and result interpretation. She received her bachelor's in biology from Rhodes College and went on to complete her PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Tulsa. During her PhD studies, Kate focused on the use of molecular biological tools, including qPCR and stable isotope probing, to assess biodegradation of petroleum, hydrocarbons, and fuel oxygenates. Also, we are happy to have Dr. Sam Bresolina as our next speaker. As Director of Research and Development, Sam works with each of the laboratories within Microbial Insights and collaborates with experts across multiple industries to continually drive innovation forward. Throughout the development of new molecular biological tools, his focus is a balance of hard science, accessible methods, and actionable data. He received his bachelor in chemistry from Berea College and went on to complete a PhD in analytical chemistry at the University of Tennessee. Throughout his PhD research, Sam focused on analysis of trace-level environmental toxins, including heavy metals and toxic gases, detection and quantification of trace contaminants in complex mixtures and media is an especially challenging field, requiring not only the development and optimization of innovative new analytical methods, but also the establishment of highly rigorous QA/QC procedures for initial and continuing method validation. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the resource section of Microbial Insights website within the next week. A link will also be emailed to everyone who registered for the webinar, so no need to contact us. After the presentation, we will have a short question and answer session. Feel free to type your questions throughout the presentation, and our speakers will answer as many as possible at the end. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. This is Sam Bresolina, Director of Research and Development at Microbial Insights, and I am excited to be celebrating 30 years of Microbial Insights with all of you, and being joined, of course, by my colleague, Kate Clark. We are going to be discussing QuantArrays today, and the best way to select the appropriate QuantArray for your site specifically. Now, for those of you who know Microbial Insights, you know that over the past 30 years, we've been a leader in innovation in the environmental remediation industry. Our goals, along with producing high quality and actionable data, is to maintain exceptional customer service, which I'm sure that anyone who's used us will recognize that we constantly strive to achieve. We also never sell products or culture, and this is a very important piece of our culture here at Microbial Insights, is that we are not a vendor. So what that means is that the data that we produce can be truly actionable and 100% unbiased, because you know that we're not biased by what we're trying to sell you based on the data that we provide you. So we want to give you actionable data, but we don't want to give you data to lead you in the wrong direction because we're not selling products or culture. We also strive to provide context for the data that we provide to you. And this kind of ties into our actionable data piece. The data that we produce, we want to help you in terms of deciding which direction to go next at a site. Our theme this year at Microbial Insights is charting the course, and I think you'll see that throughout the presentation today. But the idea is that we want to give you the information that you need to answer questions that you have for your sites, but also to identify whether you take route X or route Y in terms of which steps to go next. And from there, we'll always be present to help you out and determine what steps to take after that. Last but not least, we want to continue to push the boundaries of innovation. Anyone who knows or has followed Microbial Insights over the years recognizes that we come from a lineage of innovation. So those of you who know Dr. David White, our founder, understands that his whole goal was to take tools and innovate and transition them to the environmental remediation industry. He had both his MD and his PhD, and so he recognized that the environmental remediation industry was underfunded in some of these innovations. And so what he did was he took tools that were used in the medical industry and transitioned them over to the environmental remediation industry in a very smooth process. And so Dr. David White is a lot of the reason that we have an innovative culture within Microbial Insights and are constantly looking at tools that we can transition from other industries into new industries in efficient ways. Now, of course, since we're celebrating 30 years, we would love to highlight Dr. White. I highly recommend that if you get a chance to look up his biography, that you look a little more into who he was as a person and all of the amazing things that he did. I feel like you could write a novel based on just some of the work that he did. But also, I would be remiss to not discuss Dora Taggart, who brought on a lot of the molecular biological tools that we know of today. Dora is our fearless leader at Microbial Insights, our president, and she brought on some of the initial qPCR analyses that we now kind of call our flagship analyses here at Microbial Insights. So we're very excited to be celebrating 30 years with all of you. And of course, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for those of you out there who have worked with us closely, who have talked to regulators and shown them our data, and who have come to us with questions about their sites and fully recognize that we are here to be a member of your team. So thank you to all of you. Now, within those 3 decades of innovation, we've produced a number of different tools that are now very recognizable. I think some of you in the industry may remember the days of plate counting. And for those of you who do, and especially for those of you who performed the plate counts, I apologize sincerely because now technology has caught up, it's become affordable and accessible where it wasn't previously. Now, plate counts, for those of you who don't remember, is a way of looking at the microbial population within a sample from the environment. And the way that it worked was a sample was retrieved from the environment, it was moved into a pristine laboratory, and then cultured on an agar plate, and then literally counted the cells. And so instead, what we do now is we're able to pull a sample from the environment and immediately extract the DNA within that sample. And the reason why this is important is that over the past several decades, what we've come to find and what the literature has shown is that over 99% of bacteria refuses to grow in a laboratory environment. So what that means is that anytime you're taking a sample from the environment and putting it into a laboratory and trying to recreate the environment that it's in, it is very, very difficult, and you're biasing the counts towards what grows well in a laboratory rather than reflecting what's truly happening in the subsurface of your site. So instead, with our qPCR technologies that's now much more accessible than previous years, we're able to extract the DNA and get a true snapshot or true reflection of what's occurring in the subsurface. Now, many of you probably knew the term qPCR long before today, but unfortunately, thanks to COVID-19, qPCR is now a household name. And so it's a very much a base layer of what we do here at Microbial Insights, and it's the basis for our QuantArray technology that we'll be talking about throughout this presentation today. We also have a number of stable isotope methods. Stable isotope probing is a very powerful tool for petroleum hydrocarbon sites to conclusively prove contaminant degradation. And compound-specific isotope analysis is another very powerful site for or a tool for source delineation, and also a great tool for proving contaminant degradation as well. And then we've also been extremely innovative within this industry in our creation and use of passive sampling devices. Many of you are very familiar with our biotraps, and perhaps even our advanced version of the biotraps, our in situ microcosms. Just as I mentioned, anytime you take samples from the field and move them into a laboratory and expect them to reflect exactly what's happening in the field, you bias that information. So by using these passive sampling devices, we can get a clearer image of what's happening in our groundwater. So in terms of our QuantArray analysis, what we're able to do is look at what microbes are actually in our groundwater. So by collecting a very simple and easy to collect sample, either groundwater or soil, we can use filters, we can take activated sludge, pretty much any matrix you can think of. That is put in a cooler, sent to our lab, and then we extract that DNA directly. And then we use something very similar to our qPCR technology. We use the power of the QuantArray comes from the same qPCR technology, but used in these arrays, these microarrays. So it's a hybrid of qPCR and microarray technology. And the true strength comes from these nanofluidic capabilities that allow us to simultaneously analyze multiple gene targets within the same sample. So where we have our CENSUS qPCR, where we can analyze a single gene target at a time and quantify those targets, we also have our QuantArray, which allows us to do multiple at a time. And the nice thing about QuantArray is not only is it efficient and cost-effective, but it also allows for anyone who is unfamiliar with which gene targets to choose. It gives you kind of a menu that is pre-selected for you. So, for example, we have a number of different QuantArrays. Our QuantArray Chlor, for example, is selected specifically for sites dealing with chlorinated solvent degradation. Now, often what people note is that Dihalococoides is kind of the golden child of chlorinated solvent degradation. And certainly Dihalococoides and lots of functional genes related to reductive dechlorination are included in our QuantArray Chlor. But also within the over 29 gene targets that are included in the QuantArray Chlor are things like aerobic degradation, aerobic cometabolic degradation of chlorinated solvents. For anyone who saw Paul Hatzinger's presentation last year, you'll recognize that aerobic cometabolic degradation of chlorinated solvents is something that you don't want to overlook. So it's important to recognize that no matter what's happening at your site, whether it's anaerobic or aerobic, QuantArray Chlor can give you a much better understanding of the potential for contaminant degradation. You'll also recognize that Dr. John Wilson at the end of last year gave a great webinar as well on our MI page that you can go back and select and watch again. And that webinar also talked about the importance of some co-metabolic degradation for chlorinated solvents and relating those gene target counts to actual generally useful degradation rates. We also have our QuantArray Petro, very similar to our QuantArray Chlor, except for petroleum hydrocarbon sites rather than chlorinated solvent sites. Again, over 20 different gene targets specifically chosen for petroleum hydrocarbon degradation. Now, outside of the environmental remediation industry, we also work very closely with the corrosion industry, where our other QuantArrays typically identify the good guys, some of the microbes that help us out at these sites to reach our goals. QuantArray MIC is based on microbiologically influenced corrosion, which looks out for some of the gene targets related to corrosion and the problems that they cause. So this is a very powerful tool for those who are dealing with corrosion. And sometimes that includes folks who are in the environmental remediation industry or the wastewater treatment industry, for example. Now, the main thing that we're here to talk about today are our two newest platforms within QuantArray. And those include QuantArray NSZD for natural source zone depletion and our QuantArray BGC, our biogeochemical. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about natural source zone depletion. For those of you who watched our webinar last year that was presented by Julio Zimbron, really beautiful webinar on natural source zone depletion. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, I highly recommend that you go back and check that out. But Julio, who was with eFlux, gave a really good breakdown of NSZD. And so I'm going to talk briefly about the power of NSZD and why it needs to be looked into and added to your conceptual site models, if at all. So NSZD is this phenomenon related to quick natural source zone depletion, that is L-NAPL mass loss. And this is a very complex phenomenon. It comes into play with syntrophic microbial communities, that is, microbes that are working together in lots of different ways. It also relates to a lot of physical processes like volatilization, ebullition, which is the bubbles that form and move down gradient in the groundwater. So there's lots of different things at play for natural source zone depletion. Now, the reason why it's important is that in the past, scientists have recognized that BTEX compounds could be fermented and turned into CO2 and methane and leave up through the subsurface for pretty efficient degradation within the deep subsurface. But for a long time, it wasn't fully recognized that a number of different petroleum compounds could be fermented in the same way. So we're just starting to kind of get our feet wet in terms of understanding scientifically the power of NSZD and how it occurs. Now, this is a really great review article by Garg from Tom Sales Group, and it highlights a number of different rates related to NSZD at sites. So these are real sites and rates related to those. Now, if you were to look at these rates and recognize how powerful this is in terms of adding this to your conceptual site model and understanding what's happening at your site, you'll understand that you don't want to overlook natural source zone depletion. Right now, it's a tricky thing for folks to take into account and add to their conceptual site models because it's not well understood. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do at Microbial Insights. But in terms of how it is understood, we know that there are lots of different processes going on. This is another really good review article by Laurie in terms of natural source zone depletion, specifically looking at modeling approaches so that it can be used and added to conceptual site models. And what you'll notice is that a number of these processes include microbial interactions with these contaminants directly. And so that's where we come into play. We're here to add to that data and provide information on the microbial portion so that you can either model this information or just better understand what's happening in the subsurface with relation to natural source zone depletion. So within that same Garg review article, there is a great kind of simplified version of the zones that you would expect to see within natural source zone depletion. Now, a lot of the microbial work that we're going to look at that are included in the QuantArray NSZD occur here in the methane generation zone. Things like methanogens, which are taking these contaminants, turning them into methane. There's also acetogens, where a lot of acetate comes from the degradation of these compounds. And with that, with those acetogens comes a lot of acetate buildup. So where there's acetate buildup, we can also expect to see acetoclastic methanogens, which are methanogens that can take that acetate and turn that into methane. And so we're starting to already see kind of syntrophic relationship just within some of the NSZD targets that we have on our QuantArray. So methanogens, acetogens, acetoclastic methanogens are all included in our QuantArray NSZD. Further, we have some obvious ones like our fermenters, but we also have things like biosurfactant production. So we can look for gene targets specifically related to biosurfactant reduction, which is something that microbes will use to get more NAPL out of the pores. They want to dissolve it into the groundwater so that they can directly degrade it more easily and achieve better contact. So often where we see L-NAPL degradation in NSZD, we can expect to see biosurfactant production from the microbes that are present. We also expect to see slime and biofilm production, which is often common with these syntrophic microbial communities in terms of protecting themselves, but also to more efficiently process the L-NAPL that's present at the site. We want to look at different redox conditions within this QuantArray NSZD. So within that NSZD, we include things like nitrate reduction, iron and manganese reduction, and sulfate reduction, all of which we want to know, do we have the right conditions for fermentation and methanogenesis within the locations that we're sampling. And again, this is just a small subsection of the over 20 compounds or over 20 targets that we're looking for in our NSZD QuantArray. But one additional one are methanotrophs. These are microbial communities that we can expect to see in some of the aerobic and even the vadose zone that take this methane that moves up through the subsurface and further oxidize it into CO2. Now I'm going to move into our biogeochemical portion. Biogeochemical interactions play huge roles in the environment, especially when we're looking at complex sites and remediation strategies. Now, of course, when we talk about biogeochemistry, we're talking about interactions between all of these microbial organisms, the geology, and the chemistry itself. And again, similar to NSZD, even though it's very well studied, much more studied than NSZD, we recognize that it's a complex situation. There are lots of different elements and compounds at play in terms of biogeochemical interactions. So the reason why biogeochem is important to us is that we want to know the exact conditions of the subsurface before we do an amendment injection or before we try and do a bioaugmentation. And often the tricky thing with these geochemistry properties is that we rely on field analysis and tools that are maybe not often that reliable. So questions in terms of biogeochemical interactions: what geochemistry parameters, and I'm talking to each of you individually, what geochemistry parameters do you regularly analyze for at your sites? I want you to think about that. And then I want you to also think about what that data has helped you do. How have you relied on those geochemistry parameters at your site? Does it tell you that your conditions are reducing and therefore you move forward with reductive dechlorination? Does it tell you that you need to try and switch from aerobic conditions to reducing conditions in order to chase that strategy? What have you relied on in terms of your strategic planning? And then the last question is, what geochemistry data do you actually view as reliable? Now, the problem with a lot of the geochem data is that it's often performed in the field, and so there are major limitations. One of the biggest ones that I hear often is dissolved oxygen, and I think all of you recognize this problem, and I can't count the number of times that I've heard, yes, the DO tells us this, but we don't really believe it because it doesn't necessarily match up with the other data that we're getting. It's DO, so I don't really count on it. And this is important because in terms of making a strategy at your site, you want to be able to rely on the data that you're getting and fully recognize that, yes, there may be limitations, but it's important to have a clearer picture in terms of the strategy that's occurring. So the key takeaway there is to not rely solely on your geochemistry data to identify what's actually happening in the subsurface. And that's where our QuantArray BGC comes into play. Within our BGC, we have a number of targets related to these biogeochemical interactions, things like the nitrogen cycle. You want to know at different depths what kind of part of the nitrogen cycle you're in. Are you in reducing conditions or oxidizing? Similarly, metal reducing or oxidizing conditions. You want to know what's happening in terms of these redox ladders, like sulfur reduction, sulfur oxidation. These additionally give you additional information in terms of what strategies to take. And then, of course, we have things like fermenters, acetogens, and methanogens. So by sampling these locations, instead of solely relying on the geochemistry data, which may have its own limitations, we highly recommend using the QuantArray BGC to sample these locations and identify what's actively occurring, what potential there is for certain conditions at these sites. Now, the nice thing about this QuantArray BGC, and I'll just touch on this briefly, but it goes really well hand in hand with a new technology that we have helped develop through an ESTCP grant. This is called a MinTrap, and for those of you who are familiar with our biotraps, you'll recognize a very similar design. This is a passive sampling device that goes into a pre-existing monitoring well. It can be deployed for a certain period of time. And within this passive sampling device are mesh bags filled with sand pack, or we can fill it with your site soil. And what this does is it gives you kind of a clearer picture of what's happening in your groundwater in terms of the biogeochemistry. And so you can pair this really nicely with QuantArray BGC and identify what may be actually occurring in the subsurface. But this also has wide applications. For example, if you wanted to do a ZVI injection at your site, if you're focused on an abiotic approach, you want to look at that and see whether that ZVI made it down gradient to the points that you're expecting it to. You can use a MinTrap to be the receptor down gradient and see if, after a certain period of time, if we pull that MinTrap back up, if the ZVI has ended up within the sand pack or the site soil that is within our MinTrap. From there, you can also do biogeochemical studies. You can look to see if the right microbes are present using qPCR technology for sulfate reduction. And if they are, and there's plenty of sulfate present, then you can look for the production of iron sulfides after your ZVI injection. And as we know, iron sulfides are very efficient in terms of chlorinated solvent degradation. So there's lots of different applications that the MinTrap offers, and it pairs very nicely with our QuantArray BGC. Now with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kate Clark, and she's going to run through a few different case studies and also highlight the importance and power of a database-driven context that we can offer here at Microbial Insights.
Okay, thank you, Sam. I wanted to share an application for some of these QuantArray tools, and so I'm going to show some typical QuantArray data from a petroleum hydrocarbon site with high source area concentrations and some residual LNAPL. So I'll go over some results from both the QuantArray Petro and QuantArray NSZD to show how they can be complementary. This combination is especially beneficial for initial site characterization while you're exploring potential remedial options. It can also be helpful for performance monitoring after a treatment strategy has been implemented. So here's a map of the plume. The contour lines represent BTEX concentrations. And the BTEX concentrations are up to 60 milligrams per liter in the source. Then they decline to around 5 to 10 milligrams per liter down gradient, so they're still quite high. And then on the periphery and down at the toe of the plume, BTEX concentrations are less than 1 milligram per liter. As you might expect, the source area is anoxic and methane concentrations are highest here. Our methane concentrations are represented by color coding of the monitoring well, with green being the highest. And so the methane generally decreases as you move down gradient. And then the number and locations of selected samples for QuantArray analysis depends on the size of the impacted area and the variability in subsurface conditions across the site. For petroleum sites, we would recommend collecting samples from monitoring wells that represent distinct areas of the plume, also including a non-impacted upgradient monitoring well to determine background microbial populations. We'd like to see at least one source area monitoring well, and then monitoring wells within the dissolved plume where there's substantially different contaminant concentrations or geochemical conditions. So first I'll show the aerobic BTEX functional genes on the map with the markers color-coded. And there are a lot of different microorganisms capable of aerobic BTEX degradation. So there's a lot of functional redundancy across their genes. Here we're looking at an aggregate of 4 different gene assays: PAG, RMO, RDEG, and TOD. A green marker indicates a high concentration, yellow is moderate, red is low, and black is non-detect. We see that all wells tested had a moderate to high concentration of aerobic BTEX degraders. This isn't that unusual of a result, and it's one of the reasons we recommend collecting an upgradient background sample at petroleum sites. We can see that in MW8, a moderate concentration of aerobic BTEX genes were detected, and within the plume where we had the selective pressure of BTEX present, we see those genes were at least an order of magnitude higher. So degraders were increasing in response to the hydrocarbon availability. Now in the source area where conditions are more methanogenic, these aerobic gene concentrations were similar to background. And I also wanted to mention that since the QuantArrays cover both aerobic and anaerobic pathways, we do see both aerobic and anaerobic genes detected in the same sample. So it may be that the aerobic bacteria are active in microaerophilic niches where oxygen is available. The conditions the microbes are experiencing in their microenvironment may be different from the bulk geochemistry we measure. Or the microorganisms may currently be inactive, but they're available for when conditions are more favorable. But from this slide, we can conclude that indigenous degraders have the genetic potential to aerobically degrade BTEX at this site. So now we're going to move on to results for benzyl succinate synthase, or BSSA, which is a functional gene associated with anaerobic TEX degradation. From the colors on our well markers, we can see that this gene is more limited with the highest concentrations near the source area. There's some low concentration along the fringes, and it was not detected at all in the background location. These results show us that there's the potential for anaerobic TEX degradation to be taking place too, particularly in areas that are more anaerobic, like the source, and this is something that we would expect to see. Now here are the results for fermenters. This comes from the QuantArray NSZD analysis. Some fermenters in anaerobic L-Naples zones can biodegrade hydrocarbons to form dissolved hydrogen or acetate that can be utilized to form methane. The fermenters were highest in the source area, just where we would hope to find them. And now let's look at the QuantArray NSZD results for methanogens. Methanogens were limited in some parts of the plume, but we did see moderate to high concentrations in the source area. Methanogens utilize the hydrogen, acetate, and other substrates produced by fermenters and other hydrocarbon degraders as byproducts during the anaerobic biodegradation of hydrocarbons. Methanogens utilizing these compounds can help to ensure that hydrogen degradation remains a thermodynamically favorable process in the subsurface. The last group we're going to look at are the biosurfactant functional genes. We offer qPCR assays for 4 different types of biosurfactants: glycolipid, trehalose, liposaccharide, and lipopeptide biosurfactants. The biosurfactants can be produced by a wide array of microorganisms, and they act as emulsifying agents that enhance the solubilization and removal of contaminants, and they can also increase the contaminant bioavailability and thereby enhancing biodegradation. In this case, we were looking to see if biosurfactant genes correlate with our LNAPL, which is largely in the source area. So we do see some moderate concentrations of biosurfactant genes in the source, but generally overall the concentrations are lower compared to some of the other assays we've looked at today. So from the QuantArray Petro data, we see that the genetic potential for aerobic BTEX degradation is present throughout the plume. And if a site manager wants to implement an enhanced bioremedy by adding oxygen, from these results we know that the right indigenous degraders are present. Anaerobic TEX genes were detected in the source area as well as down gradient. So some anaerobic degradation is likely already occurring since the conditions in the source area are conducive to this process and we know the right degraders are there. We would also look at other lines of evidence, considering our contaminant trends and geochemistry, to see if these also point to the same conclusion. And then finally, for the QuantArray NSZD data, we see that the potential for natural source zone depletion is also present and could contribute to degradation. If a site manager wanted to produce this path, they can use additional tools for further investigation. So these microbial lines of evidence can really add a lot of value for the client. We have a client with a large portfolio of hydrocarbon sites and experience with molecular biological tools. They estimate that spending around $8,000 in microbial analysis over a few sampling events can save them around $300,000 to $500,000 on a remedial strategy. And this type of savings is very common for small sites and then grows exponentially with larger sites. So I'm not going to show site data for the QuantArray BGC, but understanding where your site is at on the redox ladder can be very helpful to assess the state of the site and develop a plan to shift redox conditions if needed. The QuantArray BGC includes qPCR assays related to processes at every step in the ladder. Aerobic processes we can assess include oxidation of metals, sulfur, ammonia, and nitrite. If you're interested in the nitrogen cycle, the QuantArray BGC is the most cost-effective method because it includes 10 different relevant qPCR assays. If you're interested in a biogeochemical approach at a chlorinated solvent site, a combination of QuantArray Chlor and QuantArray BGC would be beneficial. The BGC assays not only provide information on the potential formation of reactive iron sulfides, it also includes a gene target for acetylene hydratase. Since the abiotic degradation product acetylene is so transient in the environment, detecting acetylene degradation genes could provide an additional line of evidence supporting abiotic degradation, even if acetylene isn't able to be detected in the groundwater or soil vapor. So to give you an idea of what the QuantArray deliverable looks like, I have an example table here. This is from the QuantArray BGC. So with the QuantArray, you get quantitative results. The concentrations are reported with units of cells per gram for a solid or cells per milliliter. And each QuantArray suite includes results for over 20 different gene targets. We consider order of magnitude differences to be significant, so we can quickly see that in this sample, iron-reducing bacteria were detected on the order of 10 to the 6 cells per gram. And that's several orders of magnitude higher than the other microbial groups we're testing for. Although there is a lot of functional diversity present here, we did have a lot of genes detected. We know that not everyone is used to interpreting microbial data, so all QuantArray reports also display the results on a heat map to give you a general idea of whether the concentration is low, moderate, or high. The higher the concentration, the larger the population that can perform the process of interest, the more likely you are to see that effect. This heat map shows the same data as the previous table, and we can see that the microbial group with the highest concentration is plotted in the green zone, and that correlates to our iron reducers. There's also an interpretation section at the end of every report that provides descriptions of all the gene targets tested. If further guidance is needed to help someone understand their results, we have a few different options. A comprehensive interpretive report is available where a client provides us with additional background on the site, including a site map, recent chemistry and geochemistry, and then our report writer will write an interpretation of the microbial results within the context of the site. To gain a broader perspective on the results, clients can also access the Microbial Insights database to see how their results rank compared to all the other samples we've tested for a particular assay. Our qPCR database has decades of data from CENSUS and QuantArray projects, and it includes results from over 85,000 field samples collected from around the world. So these percentile rankings can help someone understand where their results fall, if their results are about average, around the 50th percentile, or maybe those results are in the 90th percentile, and it's some of the highest results Microbial Insights has ever seen for that assay. As we close today, I wanted to point out that we don't expect that for each project you'll have a microbial expert, and we're happy to be a part of your team to help you choose appropriate analyses and understand what those results mean. We've seen from countless sites that these molecular biological tools can be used in a very cost-effective way to generate actionable data. What I mean by actionable data is results that help reduce uncertainty in site conceptual models and help make informed site management decisions. This can be at any point from initial site characterization and remedy selection to performance monitoring and ultimately to site closure. We're very proud of the Microbial Insights database, and it can provide a lot of context for the data. Seeing that your results are in the top percentage of sites can help gain stakeholder acceptance and strengthen your conclusions. And then finally, we recommend to start to trend the data. As you saw from the petroleum data I shared, you can begin to draw some conclusions based on spatial trends. And then temporal trends can also be very powerful lines of evidence, showing that the right microorganisms are present and thriving and able to do the process we're interested in. To gain the most benefit from this analysis, I would encourage you to incorporate trending the data as part of your site management strategy. And that's something that we can help you understand how to do this very efficiently at your sites. So I want to thank you for your attention today. We really appreciate your time, and Sam and I would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, everyone. So if you can go into your GoToWebinar panel and notate any questions that you have for Kate and Sam, we will be happy to answer them. And it was an excellent presentation, guys, so really excited to see these questions. So the first one is, are QuantArray projects always gene-based? Do we have the capability to look at proteomics or transcriptomics, so looking at the proteins or the RNA? So I'll let you answer that one if you want, Kate.
Okay. So for the QuantArray, we're either looking at the gene and the DNA or the RNA. So we can do DNA-based analysis, or we can extract the RNA and look at the transcripts. But we don't have something comparable for proteomics at this time.
That's still in process. So hopefully over the next few years, you guys will see that start to evolve and change as we have more capabilities in the proteomics area. Okay, sorry about that. Let me look at the next question here. Do we have a QuantArray that would be appropriate to understand nitrogen cycling and or phosphorus cycling? And I see that we have several different nitrogen cycle gene sets that are available. So I'll let you answer that one, Sam.
Yes, in terms of QuantArray, a number of nitrogen cycle targets are included on the QuantArray BGC, just as I mentioned. And so it's a very powerful way of looking specifically at some of those chemistry and geochemistry cycles that we're talking about. So yes, absolutely.
There was a comment for you guys that just says, thank you guys for advocating, understanding why we're collecting specific data. And that's definitely something we want to do with every site is to understand what the question is that we're trying to answer, so the molecular tools are an advantage in that site assessment and can help you really do a good job of getting more in-depth into those results. So thank you, Cindy, for that comment. How do you evaluate pesticide degradation processes in groundwater? Kate, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So it may depend on the pesticide. We don't have very many options for specific qPCR assays related to pesticide degradation, but one option we can do is next-generation sequencing, which provides up to genus-level identifications for all the microorganisms in a sample. We don't have to know ahead of time what genus we're looking for. And so if you do research on which microorganisms have been associated with pesticide or with the degradation of the specific pesticide you're interested in, we can use the next generation sequencing to see if those microorganisms are present at the site. But that's one of the best options we have currently. But if there are specific degraders that line up with what we have qPCR assays for, we would recommend to do that as well.
Yeah, and if there's a certain pesticide of interest for a project and it's worth the client investment, there can be some R&D that's done where we can develop additional gene targets for projects. We've done that quite often over the years. So if you have a pesticide of interest, feel free to reach out and Kate can let you know what targets are involved. And if you want us to do some more research, we can look into those pathways and see if additional gene targets would be available for development. Next question, Sam, I'll let you field this one. Can we talk a little bit more about what biofilm data tells you about the microbial community at a site?
Yeah, so biofilms play a big role in lots of different ways depending on what we're looking at. If we're looking at corrosion, for example, biofilms are unwanted and they can cause a lot of problems in terms of creating their own little niche kind of microenvironments that are issues. In terms of things like NSZD, these biofilms can work to protect the community that's there, that's doing the remediation work for us. They can also, within the biofilms, there's a lot more transfer of energy, quicker transfer of chemical compounds, and water movement. So there's a lot of importance in terms of biofilms, and I'm happy to send out any papers if anyone has specific questions on those.
Great, thank you, Sam. Kate, the next question I have is, we talked a lot about these different QuantArrays that are available. Can you do any QuantArray on any matrix, or are there certain QuantArrays that, say, for instance, you would only use a biotrap sampler for?
Sure. So we can do any QuantArray on any matrix. It is just, there's no limitation to that, whether it's standard water, soil, or a biotrap. That's fine, but we can also do, as Sam mentioned, sludge, slime, just whatever you've got that you'd like to test, we can do. The biotrap could be especially beneficial for the QuantArray Petro because we know that as we saw in the example, there were a lot of aerobic BTEX genes present, but with the biotrap, we know that the microorganisms have to grow and reproduce in the trap in order to be detected. So that gives us confidence that what we're measuring is actually active in the subsurface at the time of collection. So that can help us strengthen our interpretation, knowing that what we're seeing are active degraders at the site.
Great, thank you, Kate. Sam, is there a QuantArray that has information about chlorobenzene degradation?
Yes, the QuantArray Chlor includes gene targets related to chlorobenzene degradation. That was easy.
I like that. And we also have, where we can do CENSUS target addition to the QuantArray. So let's say you have a site and the QuantArray chlor or petro are a good fit, but you have this oddball contaminant, we can also use that DNA that we've extracted for those QuantArray samples and run some additional qPCR targets, so we can always add on anything that you need that we already have developed. Kate, do you assist with interpreting the QuantArray and CENSUS data combined with the geochemical and VOC data if we provide that to you?
Yes, we do. It's a certain type of report that we offer. The comprehensive report is available for a 15% surcharge, and we would write a written interpretation of the microbial results, taking into account all of the specific data and background you provide on the history of your site.
Yeah, with 30 years of experience, we know that a lot of people aren't microbiologists, so we can definitely look at your microbiology in combination, as Kate said, with that chemistry and geochemistry, and maybe see trends that a non-microbiologist might not be familiar with. And definitely with a large number of sites we've seen over these 30 years, we can definitely add some value based on experience. Sam, how much benefit do you think that there would be to doing a QuantArray together? So maybe multiple QuantArrays on a site like a BGC, a chlor, and sampling for multiple geochemical parameters at that well, so that we could try to really understand what's happening in those locations. And this one in particular has a pilot study that's coming up where they want to use the QuantArray BGC so they can combine that with their geochemistry, but should they also do the chlor at the same time?
I love that question. Yes, and of course we can always look at your site with you to help you identify if it makes sense to do multiple QuantArrays, but most of the time it would be very powerful to use multiple QuantArrays. In some of the examples that we gave today in terms of looking at BGC, you can start to look at abiotic options for chlorinated solvent sites on top of your bioremediation options with the QuantArray chlor. So those are two powerful QuantArrays that would work together as an example.
So Kate, I have a kind of a spin-off question that is on from this one. And, some of these QuantArrays, especially molecular targets, can be more expensive than our standard chemistry and geochemistry. So can you talk a little bit about how many wells you typically see at an average site for molecular biology? Is it done everywhere or kind of selective wells across the site? And then also, how do I convince my client, that the stakeholder, that this is going to add value? Are there numbers that you can tell me that would help me to put some context to them to see the cost savings?
Sure. Okay, Dora. So for the QuantArray, one thing to mention is we do have a discount if you do multiple QuantArrays together. So that should help with the price. And already you're getting a great deal because with the QuantArray we can have over 20 different gene targets offered at a much lower cost than if you had done all of those gene targets as a la carte as CENSUS options. For a site, you don't have to do every monitoring well. You can still get some valuable data, just being very strategic about where you collect the samples. So I think just as a kind of a small site, doing maybe even as few as 3 to 4 samples, getting background, source area, down gradient, and doing that a few different times, you can still get some very good trends, in both temporal and spatial, that help you understand what's going on. So we've seen, even just investing maybe around $8,000 over those few monitoring events, they can help save hundreds of thousands of dollars by directing you toward the most effective remedial strategy.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So this one says, thanks for the responses. This may be a question for Kate offline. Have you done any work to the degradation of dinoseb, a particular pesticide? Do you know that off the top of your head, Kate?
I have had to research that before. It's only come up once before, but I have some information I could send you. So I have your name, and I'll take care of that after the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So if you have a new chlorinated hydrocarbon site and we want to prove natural attenuation processes and mechanisms, what would you do, Sam, for the microbial analysis?
I think this is a great example of how QuantArray Chlor can be used by looking at what processes are present and ensuring that the numbers, and I think this is important for QuantArray and qPCR, we're always actually quantifying these genes, these cells. So making sure that those quantities are where we would want them to be in terms of complete reductive dechlorination, for example. We also have, I mentioned briefly, but a very powerful tool called compound-specific isotope analysis. This is another very important tool in terms of trending the data. You can sample groundwater, run them through us with compound-specific isotope analysis, and directly prove that contaminant degradation is occurring. This is not something that you can do with classical chemical analyses. For example, if you see that a contaminant is decreasing over time in the VOC data, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's degrading. It could be absorbing to the soil or volatilizing up through the surface. But compound-specific isotope analysis will conclusively show that bonds are being broken. So it's a very powerful tool in terms of chlorinated solvent sites. And then additionally would be our new QuantArray BGC. This is a great tool, again, for chlorinated solvent sites. If you wanted to include the biogeochemical properties of your site into your conceptual site model, this really strengthens the case for monitored natural attenuation. And I do want to highlight that we always push for multiple lines of evidence approach. We will never tell you that you only need microbial data to help make your case. You should always be able to use your chemistry and your geochemistry data as well. And we can work with you to think through how best to make those cases in terms of all of that data together.
Great, thank you, Sam. For Kate's last comment on the QuantArray petro sampling with the biotrap, well, that will give you a presence or absence of bacteria, but not information on the numbers present in situ. Is that what you meant to say?
No, I did. So it will tell you, it may bias it towards the active, and so it would not necessarily include inactive or bacteria or genes from dead microorganisms where the DNA hasn't degraded yet. So that's kind of all that I meant to say. We still give you quantitative results, but just based on what grew in the matrix. But you can also do that analysis from groundwater or soil, and that would tell you what the complete number of genes that are free floating in the water.
Great. Thank you, Sam, or Kate, for that clarification. All right. Let's see. So it looks like that may be all the questions that we have, and we're right on time. So that's perfect, guys. Look at that. So thank you, everyone, for attending, being part of our webinar series. Over the last 30 years, Microbial Insights has really felt the love of the people in this community, and using these tools and seeing the evolution and the value of this data really makes us also proud of the job that we have. And so we're grateful for you and your participation and following on us on this webinar series. And I'm extremely grateful to have Kate and Sam on this team. As you know, if you talk to them, they're a phenomenal part just a vast wisdom for you. So please be sure to reach out to them if you have further questions. You can email them. You can send an email to info@microbe.com, or you can contact them directly, and they will be happy to assist you on any project that you have. So thank you very much, Kate and Sam, for that great webinar today. Thank you for everyone, and be watching. We've got a couple of cool new webinars that are coming up too this year. A lot of exciting changes and growth here at Microbial Insights that you're going to be hearing about, so stay tuned. And feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone, for attending.